time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The message reached the palace with almost no warning, but there was nothing casual about what Meghan wanted. This was not another request for clarification, another private conversation, or another attempt to repair old wounds. It was presented as one final demand, and when King Charles read exactly what she wanted, he understood that his answer could permanently alter his relationship with Harry. What followed was colder, faster, and more final than anyone expected. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the request alone at Windsor, and the wording left little room for misunderstanding. Meghan wanted private royal access restored for herself, Harry, and their children during future visits to Britain, controlled entry to designated estate grounds, official family accommodation when available, and direct contact with the king's household instead of ordinary administrative channels. The king's household means the private staff and offices managing his personal royal duties. Her message arrived privately, making the demand feel like a final test. The king reached the last page and stopped. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the papers, and said nothing while an aide waited. Charles understood the danger immediately. Refusing Meghan would not stay confined to rules about rooms, gates, or schedules. Harry would hear something painful. He would hear a father telling his younger son that old assumptions of family access were gone. He would hear a judgment about his family's place. Then Charles made the decision. He told the aide that the existing boundaries would remain unchanged and no permanent entitlement would be restored. Future private arrangements would be decided individually by the palace, meaning the royal administration, rather than guaranteed in advance. The answer was firm because the monarch believed uncertainty had already caused enough conflict. Yet he knew whose anger would come next. Harry received the response and read the decisive paragraph twice. His chair moved sharply as he pushed back from the table, and Meghan watched his expression harden. He told her this was not merely a refusal. To him, the language felt like a final judgment on their place inside the family. Meghan stayed controlled, but understood his fury. The demand had been their last attempt at certainty. Charles had answered by making the limits clearer. But Harry still did not know why his father had refused so quickly. Weeks earlier, one confrontation had changed Charles's thinking about trust, family access, and royal boundaries completely. He believed the palace had humiliated Meghan. What he had not yet heard was the moment that convinced the king there could be no turning back. For outsiders, the dispute could be reduced to access, security, accommodation, and royal procedure. Inside the family, it means something entirely different. Charles sees boundaries he believes must protect the crown. Meghan sees proof that distance from royal life has become permanent exclusion. And Harry sees the one thing he has feared for years: a palace willing to separate institutional rules from family affection, even when the person enforcing those rules is his own father. Harry feels the rejection more deeply than any sentence about access can explain. Stepping away from royal duties had changed his public role, but he never believed it should erase his private connection to the places, traditions, and people that shaped his childhood. Meghan sees the problem differently. She no longer wants informal permission that might disappear with changing palace relationships. She wants certainty, because uncertainty has become another form of pressure. Harry reads the response with Meghan line by line, and his frustration builds as she stays controlled. He tells her the wording makes them sound like visitors to a family in which he was born. She answers quietly that this is exactly why she wanted clear terms. The more he speaks, the more obvious the wound becomes. He is not arguing about rooms or gates. He is arguing about belonging. Charles carries the opposite fear. The king worries that one permanent exception could reopen every fight over status, security, precedent, and private royal property. Precedent means an earlier decision that can later be used to justify similar treatment. He knows one concession may not remain one concession, and that possibility weighs on him, because the argument is no longer only personal. Camilla notices his silence after the decision. The Queen Consort asks whether he expects Harry to telephone, and Charles gives a tired answer. His son will not call about the rule. He will call because he believes the rule is about him. She watches him withdraw again, understanding that he has already imagined the confrontation. William receives the same warning and does not celebrate. The prince says that once written correspondence becomes a father and son argument, years of resentment could explode at once. He knows Harry will bring old pain into the room, and Charles knows it too. Late that evening, Charles lifts his telephone, studies the screen, and almost calls. Then the king sets it face down. The father wants to speak. The monarch chooses silence. For several seconds, his hand remains beside the phone, as though one movement could still prevent everything that is coming next. That silence only makes sense when the Windsor incident, the moment he later treated as the point of no return, is finally revealed. The final demand did not create the crisis, it reopened one. Weeks earlier, Windsor had already witnessed the moment that changed Charles's thinking completely. What began as a private disagreement over arrangements became an uncomfortable test of authority when expectations collided with palace instructions. Those present understood almost instantly that something had shifted. From that day forward, access would no longer be treated as an informal family courtesy. It would become a boundary written in unmistakable terms. Harry had already been pushing for clearer answers about future family visits, and every exchange seemed to create another layer of frustration. Charles initially resisted turning those visits into a rigid system of written permissions. The king wanted some flexibility, because he still saw these encounters as family matters, not merely royal administration. A royal residence, however, is not simply a family home. It is a property managed under security, staffing, and access rules that can affect everyone using it. That distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. Harry finally confronted the issue during a private planning meeting at Windsor. An aide explained that certain estate areas could not be included automatically in future arrangements, and the prince immediately challenged the restriction. He insisted that he should not need special permission to enter places connected to his upbringing. The aide repeated the rule, but Harry's frustration was no longer aimed at procedure alone. He wanted to know who had decided that familiarity could suddenly become restricted access. Charles entered expecting to calm the argument. Instead, the king found himself facing the question he had hoped to avoid. Harry asked whether his father now saw him as a security concern before seeing him as a son. The accusation landed hard. Charles pushed a folder away and told him that affection could not be used to bypass rules surrounding royal residences. Harry answered that he never imagined his own family would one day explain those rules to him. Harry stood and left before the discussion could recover. Charles remained behind with the aide, but the monarch's mood had changed completely. He instructed the official to prepare a written framework for future access, so that no one could later argue that the boundaries had been unclear. A framework simply meant a fixed set of rules, explaining what could be arranged, what required approval, and what could no longer be assumed. The king had resisted that level of formality. Now he demanded it. Meghan later learned exactly how the meeting had ended, through Harry's private account of the confrontation. Her final demand was designed to reverse the framework born that day, not simply secure another favor. Charles recognized that immediately, and when the request returned to his desk weeks later, he knew aides could no longer carry the burden for him. If Harry challenged the answer, the king would face his son himself. The old Windsor wound had reopened. This time, Harry would not allow a written palace response to have the last word. Harry does what Charles feared. He refuses to allow the rejection to remain a palace decision. He wants the man behind it. When father and son meet privately, there are no public statements to manage. Years of anger enter the room with them, and within minutes, the argument is no longer about Meghan's demand. It is about belonging, loyalty, fatherhood, and everything neither man believes the other understands. Harry asks for the meeting himself, and Charles agrees on condition. It will remain private and focused on the refusal. The king does not want old wounds dragged into every sentence. His son arrives believing those wounds are why the decision hurts. Palace procedure means the formal system used to manage royal decisions, access, and communication. But this argument no longer feels procedural. It feels personal. Harry places the written response on the table between them. He looks at Charles and asks, "Is this the king speaking, or my father?" The monarch does not look away. He tells his son that, in this matter, the two roles cannot be separated. The answer lands harder than any statement, because Harry hears confirmation of his fear. Family affection will not overrule royal boundaries. Charles holds his ground as the argument sharpens. Harry accuses the palace of turning every family connection into a privilege that can be granted, limited, or removed. The king answers that trust has consequences, and unclear boundaries have created too much conflict. He reminds his son that royal residences are not family homes. They operate under security, staffing, and access rules, affecting more than one household. Then Charles removes the explanation Harry expected to blame. The king says Meghan's demand was not rejected because of a hostile advisor, and William did not force the decision. He made it himself, before asking anyone how the answer should be communicated. Harry rises from his chair in disbelief. His father remains seated, refusing to soften the point. Harry warns that Meghan will see the refusal as deliberate exclusion. Charles answers that he cannot make constitutional and household decisions according to how every refusal might be interpreted. Constitutional decisions are choices shaped by the monarch's official responsibilities, while household decisions govern the running of royal life. The distinction sounds cold to Harry, but to his father it explains why the boundary exists. Harry leaves furious. Charles does not call him back. Yet sentence follows his son out. The rule was created to apply consistently, and even the king intends to obey it. Harry hears rejection. Charles believes he has drawn a boundary larger than either man. Behind that boundary, the machinery of royal power is waiting to be understood. The most painful part of Charles' answer is not that he says no. It is why he refuses to reconsider. Behind the emotional argument sits a simple reality. Private royal access is never merely private. Once status, security, property, staff, and public expectations become involved. Yet the king does not hide behind palace machinery. He accepts responsibility for the choice himself, and that makes Harry's anger harder to redirect, because there is no faceless institution left to blame. Charles believes one principle has to survive the family conflict. Relatives who no longer carry out official royal duties cannot automatically receive the same standing privileges as working members simply because of blood. Working royals are family members who regularly represent the monarch in public duties on behalf of the crown. The king knows that distinction sounds harsh when applied to Harry, but he believes ignoring it would create another argument every time access, security, or accommodation becomes an issue. William receives a private written summary of the confrontation and reads it without speaking. The prince understands immediately what supporting the rule could cost him. Harry already suspects that his father and brother have become a united barrier against him, and any sign of agreement could deepen that belief. Yet he also understands why Charles fears making an exception that might later be treated as a permanent right. Charles raises the deeper concern when he speaks privately with William. The king says he does not want Harry's children to inherit bitterness created by adults, and the future king agrees that the next generation should not carry old grievances. But his father refuses to solve that problem by promising arrangements he believes cannot be sustained. Family visits remain possible. Estate access, accommodation, security coordination, and private meetings will simply be decided case by case rather than guaranteed forever. William then removes one suspicion completely. The prince makes clear in that private conversation that he never asked Charles to reject Meghan's demand. He did not draft the refusal, pressure his father, or demand a harder line. The decision belongs to the monarch alone. For Harry, that truth would remove an easy target and leave him facing the painful reality that the rejection came directly from his father. Charles later returns to Meghan's original request alone. The king reads the wording again, reaches for a pen, and writes a short instruction beneath his notes. Family contact should remain possible, but permanent automatic access should not be restored. He pauses over the sentence because he knows the difference matters. One protects a relationship. The other protects a boundary. Inside the palace, the distinction feels controlled and workable. Across the divide, it feels devastatingly different. Meghan is about to understand what the refusal means in practice, while Harry's fury begins changing into something quieter, colder, and far more difficult to repair. The answer changes nothing overnight, and yet emotionally, it changes everything. Harry and Meghan have not been banned from Britain. They have not been forbidden from seeing Charles. But certainty has disappeared. Every future royal visit will now depend on arrangements made at the time, and to Harry, that distinction feels devastating. A door may still open for him, but he no longer possesses the unquestioned right to reach for the handle. Meghan reads the final explanation without interrupting him. Palace staff have already begun working under the clarified arrangement, which means future private visits involving Harry's family must be coordinated in advance, instead of treated as standing access. Standing access simply means permission that remains available without needing a new approval each time. For her, the meaning is painfully clear. Their connection to royal spaces will now depend on permission, timing, and circumstance. Harry keeps returning to the same lines, searching for something softer inside them. Meghan does not. She folds the pages carefully, places them on the table, and tells him she will not make another request. Her calm unsettles him more than anger would have. He believes silence allows the palace version of the dispute to harden into accepted truth. She believes another round of demands would only prove that the argument has become impossible to end. Meghan stops him when he considers issuing a forceful response. She tells Harry that public accusation would not restore what Charles has refused, and it might destroy the possibility of repairing anything personal. He pushes back, insisting that saying nothing will look like surrender. She answers that not every refusal needs another battle. For the first time, their disagreement is not about what the palace has done, but about whether continuing to fight will cost them more than stopping. Charles feels the silence from the other side. The king asks whether Harry has sent any private response, and is told there has been nothing. He expected anger. He expected another challenge. What troubles him instead is withdrawal. The monarch knows his refusal preserved a boundary, but he also knows boundaries can become walls when nobody speaks across them. Harry spends hours resisting the urge to answer publicly. Meghan stays firm, and gradually his fury loses its sharpest edge. Then he makes a different choice. He writes to Charles privately with no demand, no condition, and no mention of access. The message is short. It asks only for a conversation. Charles reads it twice. After all the arguments over rules, property, and royal ground, the stalemate finally breaks. Harry is no longer approaching him as someone demanding restoration. He is approaching him as a son, and that changes everything that comes next. For days, neither side moves. Then Harry sends a message unlike anything Charles expects. There is no legal wording, no demand that the palace reconsider, and no accusation against officials. Instead, his son asks for one private conversation about their relationship, and nothing else. The change is small enough to miss, but emotionally it transforms the dispute. For the first time, father and son are preparing to talk, without asking the monarchy to solve what exists between them. Harry has accepted that Meghan will not renew the access request, and that decision changes the purpose of everything that follows. The palace decision is no longer the subject he wants to fight. Charles agrees to meet privately with no aides present and no written proposal waiting between them. An aide is simply a member of royal staff who helps manage official duties and private arrangements. This time, neither man wants anyone else carrying the weight of the conversation. Harry speaks first. He tells Charles that the refusal made him feel erased from a world that once defined his childhood, his identity, and his place inside the family. The king listens without interrupting, then answers carefully. He says denying automatic privilege was never meant to deny his place as a son. That difference has existed in his mind from the beginning, even if Harry could not feel it. Charles then admits something harder. Rules cannot repair what has broken between them. The monarch can define access, security, and official boundaries, but none of those decisions can rebuild trust. Harry accepts his own part in that pattern. He admits that forcing personal hurt through arguments over royal arrangements has made every disagreement larger and every attempt at reconciliation more complicated. The king does not reverse his answer. Charles makes that clear because he refuses to create false hope. Instead, he offers something separate from status. Direct family contact can be rebuilt without restoring the privileges Meghan requested. Harry understands the difference now, even if accepting it still hurts. He is being offered a relationship, not a return to the role he once had. Harry reaches the doorway before the meeting ends, then stops. He turns back and tells Charles he is still angry. The king answers quietly that anger is easier to survive than permanent silence. Neither man gives the other a perfect apology. Neither pretends years of damage disappeared in one conversation. But his son does not leave, believing the relationship is dead, and the father does not remain behind, believing silence has won. Outside those walls, nobody knows any of this. When the refusal becomes public, Britain sees only the explosive surface. Father and son have finally separated family from privilege. But one headline is about to turn their private crisis into a national spectacle. By morning, the private dispute belongs to everyone. Television panels argue over loyalty. Commentators divide the family into winners and losers. Supporters of Harry see a prince pushed further away, while defenders of Charles call the decision unavoidable. Yet the loudest public interpretations miss the most important development completely. Behind closed doors, father and son have already begun speaking differently, even as Britain wakes to headlines declaring their relationship shattered beyond repair. Harry watches the coverage grow harsher by the hour. Meghan's request for restored standing access has become the center of the story, and Charles' refusal is treated as proof that the old royal relationship has finally collapsed. Standing access means permission that remains available without seeking fresh approval each time. That matters because the dispute is no longer being discussed as a private family disagreement. It has become a public test of whether Harry still belongs inside royal life at all. Charles sees the same argument unfolding from the other side. The king keeps palace communication narrow and refuses to discuss the private conversation with his son. Royal residences remain governed by the same arrangements, and nothing in the formal decision changes. He understands that revealing the softer exchange might calm the headlines, but it would also destroy the privacy that allowed father and son to speak honestly in the first place. Harry grows furious as commentators describe him as permanently estranged. He knows that description is no longer completely true, yet he cannot correct it without exposing what Charles told him privately. Meghan reminds him that silence is the price of keeping that conversation real. He resents the public version of events, but she warns that defending themselves by revealing private details would drag them straight back into the cycle they had just escaped. Outside Buckingham Palace, the dispute becomes impossible to ignore. A small crowd gathers near the gates as television crews broadcast beneath a newspaper front page, dominated by the words, "Charles says no." Some visitors defend the king's decision as necessary. Others openly question whether reconciliation has become impossible. One broadcaster calls it the final royal rejection, unaware that Charles and Harry have already agreed to keep direct communication open. Charles watches part of the coverage over breakfast, then folds the newspaper and tells staff not to use private family conversations in the palace's defense. The king will accept the harsher public interpretation rather than weaponize his son's trust. Harry, meanwhile, realizes his father is doing exactly that. The world expects another royal war, but Meghan, Harry, and Charles now face a quieter choice. They must decide whether family connection can survive without royal privilege. The headlines have delivered their verdict. The final one will be made privately. In the end, Meghan does not receive what she demanded. Charles does not reverse his answer. Harry does not suddenly stop being angry. Yet the confrontation produces something more important than another palace victory or another Sussex defeat. It forces everyone involved to confront a truth they had avoided for years. Royal access and family love cannot remain the same argument forever. One belongs to an institution. The other survives only if people choose it. Meghan accepts that there will be no permanent restoration of the automatic privileges contained in her final request. She does not submit another demand, and she does not reopen the argument. Automatic privilege simply means access granted as a standing right, rather than approved separately each time. For her, that distinction finally becomes something she is willing to stop fighting. She tells Harry that their family's dignity cannot depend on what the palace chooses to grant them. Harry hears those words differently than he would have weeks earlier. His fury has not disappeared, but it no longer controls every decision. He begins to understand that any future relationship with Charles must be built personally, not through accommodation, security, titles, or access to royal grounds. The idea still hurts, because those things once felt inseparable from family. Now he is being forced to separate them. Charles carries his own cost. The king knows his refusal protected the boundary he believed necessary, but he also knows rules cannot become the only language between father and son. Palace procedure, meaning the formal system used to manage royal decisions and household arrangements, can settle access. It cannot settle grief. It cannot rebuild trust. And it cannot replace a conversation that should have happened years earlier. Then Harry calls again. He does not mention Windsor. He does not mention accommodation, security, titles, or Meghan's rejected demand. Charles does not bring them up either. They speak about family instead. The conversation is brief and imperfect, but neither man ends it in anger. For once, silence does not feel like punishment. It feels like space. That becomes the final verdict. Meghan's demand failed. Charles' boundary held. Harry was forced to accept that being the king's son no longer guaranteed the privileges of his former royal role. Yet the relationship itself was not erased. For the monarchy, the moment drew a hard line between blood and institutional access. For Meghan, it ended a cycle of asking. For Harry, it marked the painful acceptance that belonging and privilege were no longer the same thing. And for Charles, it became the moment he protected the crown without completely surrendering his son. There is nowhere left for the dispute to escalate. The demand has been answered. The boundary has been accepted. And what remains between Charles and Harry is no longer a palace negotiation. It is simply the difficult, fragile work of being family again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.